there is a language with no word for music. A language where, for those who feel the world in that tongue only, music simply does not exist. For those amongst you for whom music is a constant, a fundamental, or even a defining feature of your life, such a world seems nigh impossible to conceive of. But even so, there is a language with no word for music.
Earlier this year, I was reading this book, An African in Greenland, by Takemitsu, a memoir of a young man from Togo who went to Greenland to live with the Inuits. And I was wondering, having never experienced Inuit culture before, what this man would think of Inuit music. So I did what any self-respecting, half-asleep aspiring music YouTuber would do, and I looked it up on Wikipedia, where I was struck by this sentence.
Traditionally, Inuit languages did not have a word for what a European-influenced listener or ethnomusicologist's understanding of music. An ethnographic investigation seems to suggest that the concept of music as such is also absent from their culture.
So the Wikipedia page that I'm on is, seemingly paradoxically, claiming that the very thing it sets out to describe doesn't exist. But of course, it does. Well, kind of.
To us, and by us I refer primarily to the core Anglosphere, there is something present in Inuit culture which we, in English, would call music. But to a monolingual Inuit speaker, there traditionally existed no word that equates to the word music.
I'll apologise in advance for my pronunciation of any words throughout this video since I don't actually speak any of the languages that I'm talking about here. I've tried to find the correct pronunciation for everything, but inevitably some things will slip through the cracks.
What the Inuit do have is the word nipi, a word that encompasses a number of sonic experiences, including speech, wind, animals, nature, and, yes, music. Inuit music includes dance songs accompanied by drums, and also the katejak, or the throat game.
Conceptualised in Western terms, it certainly is music, but the primary function it plays within Inuit society is as a game.
And musical semiologist Jean-Jacques Nattiez argues it's more helpful to you in this framework than in a musical one.
And the Inuits are by no means exceptional in their lack of a concept of music. In fact, it's a feature of many non-Western languages.
The Tiv people also have no word for music. The Hausa people of Nigeria possess a rich musical vocabulary, but don't actually have a complete word for music in our sense, with the closest being roko. Indian music has its own elaborate theory and concepts. Perhaps the closest word is Sangita, but even that can contain other forms of art, such as dance.
But, in the strictly Western sense, as far as we know, there has never been a society or culture that did not, in some way, feature what we, in English, would call music. So with that in mind, I want to pose 3 very broad questions to address in this video.
Can we talk about the music of non-Western cultures if the concept of music doesn't exist in their language? And if we can do this, then should we? And more broadly, how does our language limit our understanding of pieces of music themselves when talking about any music written by those who don't speak the language?
Before we even begin to look at how our use of language impacts our understanding of music of other cultures, it's worth examining how the word music itself can impact our understanding of even English language music. The English word music is derived from the French word musique, in turn from the Latin musica, and finally from Greek musike. Languages as varied as Norwegian and Arabic have words for music that derive from this very same root. Some languages, like Czech hudba, have got their own completely unique words for music, and some, like Indonesian musi, have adopted it from European languages much more recently.
Defining music is extremely difficult, and I can't exactly answer one of the fundamental questions of musical philosophy in a YouTube video.
But I can talk about some of the problems that arise when trying to define music, and the implications that this has for our understanding of it as a concept.
Nicholas Ruet argues that the current age is one in which it has, quote, become possible without undue risk for anyone to baptise anything as music, poetry, or painting,
raising the question of how far we can actually stretch the definition of music.
Would you call a Bach fugue music? Nobody would seriously argue otherwise beyond being deliberately obtuse. Is one of Charlie Parker's wild saxophone solos music? Now no one would argue otherwise, but, for example, broadcasting pioneer and inaugural BBC Director General Lord Reith called it damnable noise and a filthy product of modernity, admiring Hitler's ban of the genre. Are some of the less melodic rappers music? Few young or musically literate people would argue otherwise, but many, especially older people, cite the inverted commas lack of melody of rap as some kind of evidence. Is Krzysztof Penderecki's highly experimental polymorphia music? Yes, say enthusiasts, academics, musicians, but no, say some of my friends who aren't that into that kind of music. Is the 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence in John Cage's 433 music? That's the cut-off point for a lot of people, but it's not universal. One example I find particularly interesting is that of the punk poet John Cooper Clarke. He released much of his poetry with musical backing from the Invisible Girls. One of his most famous poems, evidently Chicken Town, was released on his 1980 album Snap, Crackle and Bop with this kind of musical backing.
Bloody bloke got bloody stamp, waiting for the bloody cab, bloody stay at bloody home, bloody neighbour, bloody moan, keep the bloody racket down, this is bloody Chicken Town.
In any meaningful way, this is a song. There's a beat, there's lyrics, there's instruments, there's even a little bit of a melody at the start.
But when Dr. Clark performs it live, it's just him standing on stage, alone, reciting the words to the poem.
The fucking cops are fucking keen, the fucking keep it fucking clean, the fucking chiefs are fucking swine, and fucking draws the fucking line.
Is this then not music, but rather poetry? And if it's not music, then where between the two versions of the same piece does the line of music lie?
Many of the writers I've delved into in my research for this video view the matter of defining music with little direct concern. Highly influential ethnomusicologist Bruno Nettel argues that a specific definition doesn't really matter, as long as it's agreed upon that music involves sounds and the combination thereof, and that there is an aspect both artistic and scientific, creative and practical. Other writers, like Jean Molino, highlight how fraught with problems the road to definition is, since one can consider music in so very many ways, creatively, sonically, physically, as in pertaining to physics, or by the method of its production. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia, for example, defines music as an art form that reflects reality and affects man through sensible and specially organised sound sequences consisting chiefly of tones, (sound of definite pitch). Music is a specific variant of the sound made by people.
I find this particular definition so fascinating because, artificial intelligence notwithstanding, it excludes anything non-human from the definition of music, such as birdsong. Can this definition be so if, as Francois Bernard-Maché points out,
birds sing with a repetition transformation principle, pitch and rhythm, not so different to us humans? Janos Nattiez saw rain as just as musical as anything else. Nattiez, in his writing, addresses the problem by simply saying that music is whatever people choose to recognise as such, recognising music as an amorphous thing. But in his attempt to solve the problem, Nattiez displays it more eloquently than I ever could.
Since every individual's conception of music is unique, and it's so hard to come up with a coherent definition of it, the word music can be more limiting than enlightening when talking about art that sits at the fringe of the definition. By the way, I was actually quite enjoying the spot where I was sat before, but I've had to move since all the leaf blowers in Britain have decided to congregate on my video. So now I'm sat in a field.
Think back to the Categorisation, the Inuit throat game I mentioned earlier. The Categorisation is sung, nearly always between two women, as a kind of contest, a game, lasting a couple of minutes until one player can't go anymore and the other one wins. In the same way the Inuit have no word for music, we have no word to adequately describe this performance in English.
This is also demonstrative of the fact that understanding the purpose behind any music, or any art generally to be honest, is key in understanding it in its entirety.
We have a lot of art for art's sake stuff in the West right now, and that's fine, but it's by no means the only approach to art. Plenty of people and plenty of cultures view aesthetics as inherently shallow, and European aesthetics only ascended to their current supremacy in around the 18th century. To have a look at purpose, let's stick with the Inuit, for example, whose traditional songs are inherently intertwined with their traditional rituals. Or in Africa, where the conception of a musical piece is tied to its associations with dance. Chopin and Rain wrote how, in much African music, sounds, however beautiful, are meaningless if they do not offer motor responses or contribute to the expressive quality of a performance, tying motor responses, movement and dance together directly with music. Listen to this, the Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
It's certainly melodic. In any Western sense, it really is music. But the context in which it is proclaimed means that, to most, it's not really music, it's its own, completely unique thing. But this video is about language, and this is starting to stray into talking about the purpose of art more generally.
In the same way that concepts that exist in English that don't exist in other languages can colour our view of other languages' music, concepts that exist in other languages that don't have equivalents in English can also limit our understanding.
Let's, for example, talk about the Japanese concept of ma, a kind of negative space, but really it's much more complex than this. Yukiko Kisaki describes it as the pure and indeed essential void between all things, and specifically in a musical context, that ma is the silence between the notes which make the music. This concept is fairly pervasive in Japanese art, and its lack of equivalent in English can limit our own understanding of Japanese art unless we take some time to get our heads round the concept.
On Jeremy James's blog, he points to a discussion of ma between two great Japanese minds, author Haruki Murakami and conductor Seiji Ozawa, in this book, which luckily I have. Ozawa. In Japan, we talk about ma in Asian music, the importance of those pauses or empty spaces. But it's there in Western music too. You get a musician like Glenn Gould and he's doing exactly the same thing. Not everybody can do it, certainly no ordinary musician, but somebody like him does it all the time. Murakami then asks, ordinary musicians don't do it, to which Ozawa replies, no, never. Or if they do, the spaces don't fit in as naturally as this. It doesn't grab you. You don't get drawn in as you do here. That's what putting in these empty spaces, or ma, is all about, isn't it? You grab your audience and pull them in. East or west, it's all the same when a virtuoso does it.
I think this is particularly fascinating because, to Ozawa, ma is present in both Western and Eastern music, at least in the instincts of the performer, but it's his familiarity with and understanding of the uniquely Japanese concept that allows him to really appreciate the negative spaces, the music between the notes in all music, no matter its origin. Toru Takemitsu is a good composer to look at to explore this concept further, firstly because I know enough about him already to make comment, and secondly because, owing to his wartime experience, he consciously tried to distance himself from traditional Japanese music, and therefore his music can be viewed from a Western lens far more easily than many other Japanese musicians.
Let's have a look at two of his pieces, Rain Tree Sketch and Garden Rain, to see how ma manifests itself in Takemitsu's music.
Rain Tree Sketch for solo piano, generally speaking, maintains a fairly quiet dynamic and a high register, and features a lot of constant semi-quaver movement, like little drops of rain.
But these little cascades of music are frequently interrupted by full bars filled with rests.
It's been compared to disturbing the branches of a tree and seeing the raindrops fall out, before stillness and quiet returns for an equally brief moment. To me it sounds like raindrops falling on a still lake, rippling out elegantly, but nonetheless disturbing the picturesque serenity of the water's otherwise still surface.
But this only dawned on me when I started considering the piece in terms of its silence, which, I confess, I hadn't really thought about until researching ma for this video. I'd listened to the piece a lot, but fairly passively, never actually playing or analysing it. But once I started considering it in terms of its silence, I was shocked by how deafening that silence really was. And now it's those very moments of silence which I had ignored which are the most shimmering and crystalline moments of the whole piece to me.
Garden Rain, on the other hand, wasn't a piece of Takemitsu's I was familiar with before this video, so I don't have the same frame of reference that I do with Rain Tree Sketch, but the contrast between silence and sound seems even more stark here. Garden Rain's abrasive harmony and sharp, direct brass instrumentation leaves very little room for the listener to breathe. Instead, it is the silences that release the tension, providing the listener a chance to recuperate. Takemitsu does this consciously with his understanding of ma, saying, "What I want to do is not to put sounds in motion towards a goal by controlling them. Rather, I would prefer to let them free, if possible, without controlling them." Look in contrast at perhaps the most famous piece of Western classical music inspired by the rain, Chopin's Prelude Opus 28 No. 15 in D-flat major, or as it's more commonly known, the Raindrop Prelude. The raindrops here are the constant quavers. And that makes sense, right? Rain is often thought of as a cascade of many tiny individual pieces of water. But look at the scores of Rain Tree Sketch and Garden Rain. The importance of the empty space is right there on the page in the bars of rests. I'm not suggesting that we all need to be native or fluent Japanese speakers to understand that silence matters in a piece of music, or even that the silence can speak for itself in these two Takemitsu pieces. Rather, I'm suggesting that even a small look into concepts and ideas that don't have an equivalent in the English language can radically transform the way you listen to music of a certain culture. I know it changed the way I thought about Takemitsu's music.
On a micro level, the language that we speak can have an impact on the music we compose. The obvious starting point here is tonal versus non-tonal languages. For those unaware, tonal languages are languages in which the pitch and pitch contour of a word can alter its meaning.
Pitch does alter meaning in non-tonal languages like English. Think about the difference between really and really, with the pitch rising at the end obviously indicating a question. But the word still fundamentally means the same thing, unlike in tonal languages, where the meaning of the word itself can be completely altered. The various meanings of ma in Mandarin is the classic example of this.
The jury is kind of still out as to whether or not speaking a tonal language helps with musical ability. Some studies argue that those who speak tonal languages have better absolute pitch and are better at discerning melodic patterns, whereas others have argued it almost muddies the waters of musical understanding.
Aside from impeding or helping musical ability, how do people who sing in tonal languages, considering the contour of the pitch can impact the meaning, even sing? The simple answer is that it depends on which tonal language you're talking about, since tonal languages crop up all over the world. In Mandarin, for example, the tones are usually ignored in favour of just writing a melody, meaning that it can often be difficult to understand the lyrics of a song unless they are seen written down. In Twi, the language of the West African Akan, the contour of a melody reflects the contour of the tones in speech. The exact intervals and the exact pitches don't matter, but whether the melody is rising or falling does. If the melody is really moving in the complete opposite direction to the tone, auxiliary notes can be added to keep the words intelligible, language literally contorting the melody of a piece of music.
So that's one way in which melody can be impacted by language. But how about rhythm being impacted by the language that we speak?
Obviously, language and music are related in the sense that they both have the same two axes of time and sound, and are complex processes.
Probably why we hear the music as a language metaphor so commonly. There's been a few studies to suggest that the native tongue of a composer can impact the rhythms they choose in the music which they compose.
A study by Patel and Danielle measures this closely, with fascinating results. Firstly, a little bit of linguistics. Stress-timed languages, like English, have the rhythm between stressed syllables more equal, whilst otherwise, the rhythm of the language is a little more uneven, with unstressed syllables being spoken a little faster. On the other hand, syllable-timed languages, such as French, are more even across all syllables. Patel and Danielle, therefore, choose to compare English and French music and see how this linguistic difference impacted the music. They use something called the NPVI, or Normalized Pairwise Variability Index, an equation meant to measure the amount of contrast in time between different events in a sequence. Basically, how to measure the rhythm of language. Look at the difference between English and French in this value, with the more even rhythm of French scoring lower. In the study, the two chose a list of works from the late 19th and early 20th century and compared them, with the starting note of each piece being arbitrarily given a value of 1, and other values being based with relation to that. Looking at the graph, see how the MPVI value of English music and French music lines up fairly similarly with the difference in the MPVI value of the language. Apart from one massive and interesting exception in Vincent d'Indy. However, the researchers explain this by his contempt for his French contemporaries, preferring the quote serious and uncompromising principles of German symphony, and the Teutonic, Bach, Beethoven, Wagner tradition, so says Fred Goldbeck. The rhythm of the language that we speak therefore can influence the rhythms in the music that we write. Any classification is superior to chaos, said French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss.
And us humans certainly have a penchant for categorisation, with music being no exception. We've already looked at the word music itself, but within that, how do different languages categorise different aspects of music differently?
Let's look, for example, at Javanese music. Most Javanese music makes use of what we consider percussion instruments, things like the gong, and so the categorisation of percussion instruments in Javanese music differs significantly from that in English. In the West, percussion instruments are categorised in two basic ways, either by their usage or by their sound production. Categorising them by sound production, we have either pitched or unpitched percussion instruments, and categorising by their usage, we get idiophones like the cowbell, membranophones like the snare drum, chordophones like the piano, and aerophones like the whistle. Javanese classification, on the other hand, is much more to do with the physical action of the human playing the instruments.
I won't attempt to pronounce all these in Javanese, but they are split into, for example, those beaten with a padded hammer, a hard hammer, hand-beaten, or shaken. But this is just a feature of the language, right? Why should this matter to the musician or the average listener? Well, understanding the specificity with which different instrument groups are categorised within language can help in understanding the priority and importance given to different families within a culture's music.
Percussion instruments, and apologies to anyone who plays them listening here, have generally been considered lesser than those of other families in Western music, excluding the piano, but that's a different point. Javanese music places the importance of percussion instruments much higher, and you can tell this from the greatest specificity in the categorisation. Margaret Kartomi puts it this way: you could tell whether a society has been bread or rice-based as their staple food by looking at their language. In English, England has been a bread-based society for most of its history, and we have separate words for wheat, dough, bread, toast, flour, etc. Whereas we just have one catch-all word for rice in all its forms. Contrarily, Javanese has different words for rice depending on factors like whether or not it's washed.
This is the same with instruments. looking at categorization in language can help us understand how important, or not important, different aspects of music are to a culture. Interestingly, Javanese categorization has mostly been an oral tradition, but recently academics have tried to kind of codify it in writing, in which categorization has taken on a more material-based approach.
Bronze instruments, leather instruments, wooden instruments, wire instruments, bamboo instruments. Perhaps this is not so different to our brass instruments, string instruments, and woodwind instruments.
So, have I come closer to answering any of the questions that I posed at the beginning of this video? Firstly, can we talk about music of non-Western cultures if their conception of music doesn't line up with us? Well, when it comes down to it, we sort of have to. If we live forever and we had infinite time for learning and musical understanding, then it would be great to learn every language and get to grips with every individual language's conception of music, but that's just unrealistic. It's a compromise to consider Inuit music in the Western sense, or Japanese music in the Western sense, but it's a much better compromise than not listening to the music at all. The more music and art we consume from all different corners of the world, the more well-rounded we are as musicians, listeners, and, well, people. My second question concerns whether we should talk about music in non-Western cultures if it doesn't exist as a concept, and the answer is pretty similar, but it is the best that we've got. It's not like the term world music, which is kind of a tautology in itself. There is no culture without music. Music is of the world. World music is a Eurocentric, if sometimes annoyingly helpful term, that places Western music as something special, and other cultures as all kind of the same because they're not Western. It takes very little effort to actually just name the culture's music that you're talking about. But talking about music at all this way isn't quite like that. When it gets into a deeper understanding of what music is or means to a culture, it's just not feasible for the average listener to do. What I would say is that for the more analytical listener or the musician wanting to broaden their understanding of music, probably closer to the type of people watching this video, that learning about how language shapes our conception of music can help us break out of those fixed mindsets we all find ourselves in sometimes and open up a whole new world of musical understanding. But also, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you just want to broaden your range of listening a bit and stick on a playlist of some songs from around the world, then go ahead. You'll only be better off for it. But if you're taking a kind of deep dive into the music of a particular culture, learning a few local musical terms, getting your head around a few linguistically unique musical concepts, and, well, seeing if there's a word for music at all, is an essential and really overlooked part of musical understanding. And my third question was about how language impacts the actual music itself, and I've hopefully given some good examples as to how this can work with things like rhythm and melody being impacted by language, concepts like the Japanese concept of ma, and how singing can work in tonal languages. So next time you're listening to music from any corner of the world, you can keep in mind how the local language might be impacting the music you're listening to. It can also give you a totally new understanding of a piece of music that you already knew and loved. I know it certainly did for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know it's been a little while since I've uploaded one. I've been super busy, and also this video has taken a lot of research, writing, editing, filming to make. As always, all the sources I've used for the video will be in the description below. And if you did enjoy, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or as I always say, my favourite is to leave a comment, because I always love hearing what you guys have to say about my videos. And hopefully, I'll see you next time.